We go. Okay, well, welcome, as I say, everyone, to this Biographers Club event with Jane Ridley, and we're talking about her splendid new biography, if you can see it there, of George V. Many of you will know Jane, both as chair of the club, as distinguished biographer. She's professor of modern history at the University of Buckingham, where she teaches biography. Her books include Lives of Lutyens. She won the Duff Cooper Prize for that. The Young Disraeli, Edward VII, I think Piers Brendan called that one of the best royal biographies ever written. And now George V. And Jane, all the reviews I've seen, everything I've seen written about this book has started off with the D question or the B question. In other words, how dull, how boring was George? So I thought I'd start off by asking you whether you embarked on this project with any trepidation, whether you thought this is going to be a lot more challenging than writing about the very colourful Bertie.
Well, Nick, thank you very much, first of all, for that very generous introduction. I did have slight trepidation, I have to admit, embarking on George V. I knew that the reign was fascinating, and there was an awful lot to write about there. And I knew that, you know, there was big, interesting questions about how did the monarchy survive and get stronger under George when most other monarchies collapsed. But the researcher of George V is not encouraged by his diary, which is one of the most sort of principal sources that we have for George V. And that is really, you know, every day it starts off with the weather, what time he got up, when he had breakfast, what he did in the morning, what time he had lunch, who came to lunch, if anybody, what he did in the afternoon, and what time he went to bed, which is, you know, 11:10 or 11:30 on a regular basis. So ploughing through this sort of thing does make you feel, oh my goodness, it's going to be really hard to make this man interesting. But in fact, I think now, I mean, I don't think I could have spent 7 years with him if he was really like that, which is what it took me to write the book. And I think now that, in fact, George is an intriguing and clever and rather impressive character, but also quite, you know, he's quite funny. At least I think it's funny. I don't know whether he thought he was being funny.
Can you tell us a bit about what sources you used? First of all, perhaps it's a subject by itself, the Royal Archive. In the past, it's had something of a reputation for being, well, or obstructive, even when it thinks it's being helpful, and for only allowing you to visit at odd times and then for only brief periods at a time. How did you find the Royal Archive when you were researching this book?
I found the Royal Archives, actually, when I was researching George, incredibly helpful and friendly, and you know, really doing what they could to make things easy. There was no attempt to sort of censor anything that I wrote, or to even, they didn't even particularly want to read it. In fact, I don't think they probably did read it. All they were interested in was that the sort of references on the footnotes were correct. And that actually was incredibly difficult to do, because footnotes really are very, very complicated, but they were helpful about that as well. I think there's been a great change at the Royal Archives, and that they now rather like people coming to do research, when in the past there was slight sense that they wanted to get on with their archiving. I think also that, you know, my subject, George V, there was nothing really scandalous that they might worry about, unlike Edward VII. With Edward VII, you know, all those mistresses, I had to demonstrate with documentary evidence that each mistress was a mistress, and there was so much rumor and so much gossip and scandal that it was very hard to do this. And, you know, the number of mistresses fell disastrously in my view, because I couldn't actually prove. And of course, the whole point was that both George and sometimes his Edward, and sometimes his mistresses were deliberately trying to hide the evidence. You know, that Edward VII was very much aware of the dangers of his love letters getting out into the public domain. So the Royal Archives, well, it's a wonderful place to work, really, and it was a great privilege to be allowed to work there, I have to say.
Right. Did they tell you, did they indicate to you that there were any sensitive areas? I mean, sometimes quite surprising things can be sensitive. I believe the royal family has always been very nervous about details of its health issues.
Yes, I think that used to be one of the things that was sensitive, and you certainly couldn't write things based on material in the Royal Archives. So you could write what you like based on material elsewhere. And I think also an issue that was a bit of a problem when I was doing Edward VII was Victoria's relationship with John Brown, which was obviously a worrying concern, but rather a long time ago, we have to think really to matter still. And also whether Edward VII spoke with a German accent, which was again difficult to prove because I couldn't find any signed recordings of his voice at all. So these, I mean, you know, they weren't interested particularly in the politics, which you might have thought might have been, you know, more of an issue, but it was these sort of personal questions that concerned them.
What material? Right. What material was there for you apart from George's boring diaries?
Well, George's diaries turned out to be wonderful. Because it means you've got this ready-made, incredibly detailed chronology of every day. Yeah. You know what time he got up on what the day that such and such happened. So for any biographer, actually, they're gold dust. It's just they're not terribly entertaining. I mean, it does half the work for you. But there's also, well, I mean, there must be a catalogue, but there isn't a catalogue yet publicly available of George V's papers. But the political papers are absolutely fascinating, and a lot of them are written by George's wonderful secretary, Lord Stamfordham, who's the sort of one of my heroes, I have to say, who is there to give George advice, to teach him how to be king, and basically all the sort of political policy of the reign is, or most of it, a double act between George and Stamfordham. And it's never really clear who is the, whether it's George or whether it's Stamfordham who's making the big decisions. But Stamfordham writes these marvelous sort of memos. Every time there's a political crisis, he, puts on his frock coat and goes down to Westminster and picks up all this sort of gossip from the political leaders and writes it all down in very, very neat black copper plate hand for George to read. And together they make a decision about, who they're going to make prime minister or what the next government should be. And it happens. I mean, they're a wonderful duo. So this is all very clear from the information in the Royal Archives, I think.
Right. Now, this is almost as much of a biography of May, later Mary, of Tech, as it is of George. Did you ever think that perhaps it could be a joint biography?
Yes, I did. For quite a while, I thought it was a joint biography. It started off being George. The original title was George V, the King of Dull, which I had to read. I completely abandoned really halfway through. May was for a start, she wrote much better letters than George, although her diary actually is just as dull as his. She could be funny. She was well educated, and she's a great character. I think she's very formidable but rather wonderful. In fact, I rather fell in love with Queen Mary. But I felt that really the trouble was that she died. George died in 1936, and Queen Mary went on until 1953. And so that would mean if I gave that period, the detail that it would need to make into a proper biography, I'd have a really long and dying fall, as Queen Mary gets weaker and weaker. So I thought it was better to end when George died, which was really a sort of, before the abdication. And Queen Mary appears as a sort of, as a key figure, but it's not her book, it's his book.
You have a lovely phrase in here about Queen Mary's interest in her friends' jewelry and other valuables as bordering on the predatory. Now, I seem to remember that Hugo Vickers told us at the Biographers Club a year or so back that Queen Mary as a guest would arrive and help herself to any objet she decided she fancied. I think you rather exonerate her of these charges.
Well, it's certainly true that that's what people said about her. That she's accused of being almost a sort of kleptomaniac. And whenever she went to somebody else's house, she would sort of admire whatever it was, a beautiful clock or a beautiful antique, and would say, "I'm adoring it with my eyes." And if that didn't work, and there was no answer from her hosts, she would say as she was leaving, "Oh, I must just go indoors and say goodbye to that enchanting little clock." And if that didn't work, there might be a letter from her next morning offering to buy the object, whatever it might be. But I don't think that, I did try to sort of, there's so much gossip about this, as with the mistresses of Edward VII, it's the same sort of story. I tried to sort of discover how many examples that people could actually actually prove that this happened. Was it just sort of talk, or was it something that really did happen? And I could only find about 2 times where a clock vanished or something like that. Otherwise, I think it might have happened once or twice. I think that it became gossip, and so as a sort of almost a joke, whenever Queen Mary appeared for tea or something, people would make a point of, putting away with Faberge, or whatever it might be, that Queen Mary's eyes might fall upon. I just think Queen Mary's, she was just so regal and grand. I just don't think it was in her character to, ask for people's probably rather second-rate possessions compared to hers. I do think, though, that she had a strong sense that anything that was represented, picture, a painting of members of the royal family or whatever like that, that really was hers by right, or at least was the family's by right. And she was quite she would really collect those things very firmly and buy them and keep them at Windsor.
Hugo Vickers, of course, updated James Pope Hennessy's Life of Mary, and he was able to put in things that Pope Hennessy had to leave out. So that brings us on to previous biographies of George and how valuable they were to you and what you've been able to add to them, because we're 50 years later, so from the last one.
Yes, but George was very fortunate in his biographers. I mean, the official biographer of George V was Harold Nicholson, who's a great biographer, great writer, great literary gentleman. And then that was followed in 1983 by Kenneth Rose's book. But I think that what I've found with both of these actually is that it's terribly important if you possibly can to actually look at the biographer's archive. It's not just the biography, which is obviously crucial, but it's what the biographer says about their work or what they managed to collect. And I think biographers' archives are kind of neglected source by many biographers. But when you're writing a biography, you collect so much stuff, and you absolutely mustn't throw it away. You must keep it. When you die, you send it off to somewhere in America, and and it will be very important for future biographers. So Harold Nicholson, while he was researching George V, he kept a diary. and the diary was partly published and printed by Nigel Nicholson when Harold was very old. But large chunks of the diary were reckoned by Nigel Nicholson to be far too indiscreet, far too candid, far too truthful, and far too scandalous to be published in the published version. And so when I read Harold's diaries, which are in Balliol College Archive in Oxford, I realized that, the rather stuffy book that Harold wrote, which is very official. I mean, it was written in 1959, in 1952, sorry, which was a time when people were very sort of restrained in what they said in public about the monarchy. But in his diary, he pulls no punches, and it's a fascinating document, and it's funny, and it makes you realize that the court of George V was not nearly as dull as it was made out to be by Harold Nicholson, that it was full of the most extraordinary characters, and it functioned in a way I think that no other court did. I mean, it was, it was a weird combination of the domestic and the very grand. And again, with Kenneth Rose, he kept fewer notes, I think, about his book about George, but there are his diaries, which were recently published, are very helpful for any biographer. And then, of course, there's the wonderful Pope Hennessy, and Pope Hennessy's great book about Queen Mary. And Hugo Vickers did publish in The Quest for Queen Mary a series of interviews that Pope Hennessy made, but felt that he couldn't print, quite rightly, in 1959, because they were extremely scathing about all sorts of people, well, obviously about Queen Mary, but also about the Queen. But also, I was lucky enough to get into Pope Hennessy's archive, and he had the most amazing biographer's archive, almost, transcribing almost all of Queen Mary's papers, I think, and very accurately. I don't know whether he did it, somebody did it for him, I think. But that was complete gold dust, because it meant that I had the material to basically to make Queen Mary into a major dominant figure, which perhaps I couldn't without that archive.
Well, just as a sideline, what's going to happen to your archive, Jane?
Well, I was just thinking about it this afternoon. I'm sure my children will probably, they'll want to send it to be recycled, I should think.
Now, George came to the throne in 1910. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
And almost immediately had to encounter several political crises. I think the first one being the possible Parliament Act and the desire of Asquith that he create a whole load of Liberal peers in order to get the act passed. To the contemporary reader, this episode, and indeed others, we might actually treat these controversies in sequence. It's extraordinary the level of involvement of the monarch in political crises of the time and the importance of his role. Could you say a bit about that? And also about how well he dealt with these crises?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because George received very little preparation for becoming king. I mean, he got on well with his dad, but he didn't learn much about how to be king from Edward VII. He did do some lessons on being king with an Oxford don who taught him to read Bagehot. And all the historians of George V say that George V was taught by Bagehot or learned how to be king from reading Bagehot. Basically, what Bagehot said was that the role of the monarch was to warn and to encourage and the right to be consulted. Those three things. And in fact, if you look at George's reign, it doesn't fit Bagehot at all. He's much more hands-on. He absolutely right to say he comes to the throne in 1910 in the middle of the worst political / constitutional crisis that Britain had at least since the Great Reform Act, if not since, you know, the Glorious Revolution, and he hadn't had any briefing from his father, who died. Edward died very suddenly, and he died after spending several weeks abroad in Biarritz and not seeing his son. So that George is really acting completely, you know, without any. It must have been terrifying, actually, without any background, without any real interest in politics. Here is the Prime Minister Asquith pressuring him to agree to create peers in the future if the Liberal government wins the election. And George makes a really perhaps the most important blunder of his career at this time over the Parliament Act. And he is bamboozled by Asquith and agrees to do this, and suddenly realizes that he has made a promise that he should never have made, and that Asquith has duped him, and that Asquith thought that he made no secret of the fact that he thought that George was pretty stupid. And George realizes that from now on, he's going to really have to go about things in a different way, and to become, make the monarchy into a kind of a political force which is above party politics. And he himself had very strong private views that were very Tory, as you might expect. But when it came to making decisions as king, he is really incredibly impartial. And basically trying to push things along to make what he considers in the best interests of the country, or in best interests of his people. So it is an extraordinary transformation that comes about in George when he becomes king. And I think one of the things about kings is that you can, or queens, is that you can never tell whether they're going to step up to the plate or not. Nobody would have thought that George V, who was very much despised as Prince of Wales because he said very Tory things, such as, you know, Asquith is very common, in a loud voice. But when it came to it as being king, he surprised everybody by turning out to be politically extremely effective and intelligent.
As I say, it is quite surprising the level of his involvement in these controversial issues, and indeed later on we'll come to this, the creation of a national government. Now, if our own Queen were involved to such an extent, I think there'd be a bit of an outcry. At what point did things change and the level of influence of the monarchy decrease to the level at
well, I think in a funny way, George's influence was greater than his father in some ways, and greater also than Queen Victoria. And I mean, his reign is rather exceptional. And I think that the reason for this, or one reason for this, is that this was a time of political realignment. When in the 1920s and 1920s particularly, and 30s, you get hung parliaments, and you don't get a clear, decisive result about which party should govern. And you also, the other thing that happens is that, you know, Prime Minister dies in office, bona law. And rather than what would happen now, which would probably be an election, what happened then was that it was down to the king to appoint the next Prime Minister. So that the political circumstances mean that the king has to play a much greater part. The other thing is that there's no, at that time, there was no, you know, when, for instance, Mrs. May stood down, there was there was a procedure for producing a new Tory leader and Prime Minister, but that didn't exist in the 1920s and 30s. It was just, you know, it was up to the king to make these decisions. So he is plunged into extraordinarily difficult circumstances. He genuinely, I think, makes the right decisions. I mean, him and Lord Stamfordham, as I was saying, are this great sort of political duo who are exercising this huge influence on early 20th century Britain.
Well, the next crisis, I think I'm right in saying, was Irish Home Rule. Could you describe George's role in that
Well, here the problem was that the Asquith government is under pressure from the Irish nationalists to grant home rule for the whole of Ireland. But it's becoming increasingly plain by 1914 that the Protestants of Ulster are not prepared to accept that, and that there's a real danger of civil war. Now, Asquith's reaction to all of this is to say that the Ulstermen are bluffing and it's fine and it'll be okay. They can give the whole of Ireland home rule. But George does much more work on the Irish question than the Prime Minister does. He amasses an enormous correspondence, writes to all sorts of politicians and people involved with Irish politics and people with opinions on the Constitution, etc. And his concern, he says he doesn't really mind whether there's home rule or not, but what he does mind is if his subjects start killing each other. And so his concern is to prevent home rule, which is rather than to support one party or the other. To that end, he summons this Buckingham Palace conference in the summer of 1914. And of course, that conference breaks down famously because of the outbreak of the First World War. So we don't really know whether George would have succeeded. But I think it's interesting. I mean, as you rightly say, I don't think the monarch today would take a political initiative like that. Certainly not.
George was close to his cousin, Nicholas II. And it became apparent that the Romanovs were in a great deal of trouble. And the question arose of whether we or some other country could offer them asylum. It has become something of a stain on George's reputation that we didn't offer the Romanovs asylum. But here you're inclined to exonerate him of blame for this. Can you tell us a bit about what happened then? Well,
I don't entirely exonerate him. I certainly, it was his decision not to give asylum to Nicky. His first reaction when he heard that Nicky had abdicated and revolution had broken out in Russia was to send a friendly telegram. And then when the Russian government approaches Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, and says, please, will you give asylum to the Tsar? We've got to have him out of Russia. Lloyd George says, yes, fine, but I'll just have to run this past the palace. And when he does that, at first, George and Stamford are sort of moderately okay about it, but very soon it becomes clear that they are changing their mind and that they do not want, under any circumstances, to have the Tsar in Britain. I mean, the thing is that, in fact, it didn't really matter what the King of England thought, because it was impossible for the Tsar to leave Russia by now. He was surrounded by, huge barracks full of soldiers. He couldn't have left his palace in St. Petersburg and traveled to England. But the thing is, the point is really that George did not know this. He thought it was he thought there was a real prospect of bringing Nicky to England. And he was terrified by the thought of it. And the reason for that was that he believed that if we gave asylum to the Tsar, that this would encourage Bolshevism in Britain. It would encourage, republicanism and socialism and all the enemies of monarchy. And faced with that choice between helping his cousin or keeping his family on the throne, George, he was a monarch through and through, and the basic instinct of monarchs is survival, their own survival.
Right. I suppose what I thought was the exonerate. It wouldn't have made any difference.
No, absolutely. Sorry, yeah. Yes, no, absolutely, yeah.
As you say, it was almost certainly by instinct a Tory, but it seems that the Prime Minister he got on with best was Ramsay MacDonald. Is that right?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, he hated he hated Lloyd George. He always sort of starts off hating them and then things settle down a bit. But certainly Lloyd George treated him abysmally and didn't consult him, didn't listen, and did terrible things like creating George's enemies to making them peers and giving them jobs which brought them very close to the king. But Lloyd George had no time for George V either. And he would say, when he was summoned to go to the palace, he would say, I wonder what our little German friend has got to say to me today. Lloyd George was the worst prime minister, but you would have thought that George would have got on quite well with Tory prime ministers, as you say, because they shared the same politics. But he really didn't terribly like Baldwin, who was prime minister for a lot of the interwar years. And Baldwin was always rather supercilious and treated the king in a rather patronizing way. And didn't listen to him in the way that Lloyd George perhaps didn't listen to him. So the king really got on with Ramsay MacDonald, the Labour Prime Minister, as you rightly say. And again, I think this is interesting. I mean, Ramsay MacDonald famously, loved duchesses. So he was easy to sort of seduce from that point of view. But I think that it was deeper than that. I think that George and Ramsay, I think for George, Ramsay MacDonald was rather like a sort of a glorified gamekeeper, wearing beautiful tweeds and speaking with a slight Scottish accent. And they understood each other from that point of view. They were both rather sort of, at the end of Ramsay MacDonald's first government, George says to him, George's words to Ramsay MacDonald were, I do hope you think me an ordinary man. And so there was a sort of bond between them. They were both ordinary men.
Someone, was it Harold Nicholson, said of George that particularly in the years before he came to the throne, that the only things he did was shoot game and stick in stamps.
Yes.
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you about was that researching this book, you had to learn quite a bit about two subjects, philately and jewelry, because they were both obsessions of George and May respectively. How did you find learning about those subjects?
I also had to research shooting as well a bit. I found philately, George's, he amassed this extraordinary collection, massive, one of the most important stamp collections in the world. So I think it's too easy to just sort of brush off George's stamp collecting as showing that he hadn't grown up and he was just a little boy still doing little boys' hobbies. His stamp collection is worth millions of pounds. And I did actually get to see it, and it was in St James's Palace, and it is extraordinary. Volumes and volumes full of these stamps. And I was shown one volume which contained just one page on which there was just one stamp in the middle of the page, a very sort of coarse, crude blue stamp. And this stamp was called the Blue Mauritius. It was almost the most, I think probably the most valuable stamp in the world. And so this tiny little bit of crude paper with no inherent sort of, there was nothing in it to look valuable at all. It would be very easy to destroy it, for example, was this sort of philatelist sort of dream. And George, the other thing about George's collection was that he concentrated entirely on stamps from Britain and the British Empire, so that most of the stamps that he collected, if not all of them, had his head on the corner. This must have been quite nice for him to see himself being reflected all over the world. But I can't say I sort of grasp the sort of the intricacies of stamp collecting. When it came to jewelry, yes, also jewelry obviously was Queen Mary's obsession. And when she dressed for sort of courts, which happened 4 or 5 times a year, she had this sort of wonderful uniform of, a huge tiara, pearls wound around her neck, 10, 15 rows of priceless pearls, her sort of, wonderful diamonds pinned into every part of her dress, the garter, the lot. And I think that also Mary was very keen on amassing a greater collection, and particularly the chief source of sort of bargain basement jewels in the 1920s was Russia, and the various Russian families, the Romanovs particularly. The jewels which were either sold by the Soviet government when it was feeling short of cash, or smuggled out of Russia by the various Grand Duchesses, and particularly by the Empress Marie, otherwise known as Minnie, who was the sister of George's mother, in other words, George's aunt, sister of Queen Alexandra. And there were all sorts of stories about how when these the Romanov jewels were finally sold off in 1929, because the Romanov Grand Duchesses were so poor, they needed some more money. It was alleged by a lot of writers that this was done but the sort of Queen Mary had actually behaved rather badly over this, and that she had not paid the right price for these fantastic jewels. She'd insisted on paying far less than they were worth. And this became, and I sort of couldn't believe this. In fact, it was very satisfying to discover that actually somebody who'd researched all these jewelry sales had been able to show that Queen Mary hadn't cheated the Grand Duchess Senior at all. She'd paid the market price, if not above. This made me feel that really, if you looked at all the other things that Queen Mary had done, I'm sure that she had behaved in an honourable and decent way.
Did George, am I right in remembering, give Mary a Faberge egg that had been the possession of the Romanov royal family? And inside it were portraits of the children too. It seems an extraordinary thing to give as a gift.
You're quite right. He did give that Faberge egg, which is one of the best Faberge eggs, I think, to Queen Mary with the portraits of all the children. And you do rather wonder what he felt about it. And you do rather wonder also what he felt about when the news came through in 1918 that the entire Romanov family had been murdered at Ekaterinburg. Although, because the most extraordinary thing about that is that George in his diary is furious about it and says, why couldn't the politicians rescue that poor family? He seemed to have had complete amnesia about what had happened, a year or so before, when he himself had refused to allow them to be rescued.
Well, there seem to be other examples of, I don't know whether dissociation is the right word, but in his life. So he could be, as you say, sentimental about animals and think nothing of shooting up to 1,000 game birds a day.
I know, that's another example of disconnect. I quite agree. Yeah. I think we have to remember with his shooting that he was an absolutely brilliant shot. And he was one of the top 5 marksmen in Britain at that time. And it was a time of when there were an awful lot of country gentlemen who did nothing else but shoot. So standards were high. So most of the birds that he killed would have been shot straight away. They wouldn't have been wounded. He would have shot them in the head, I'm sure. But nevertheless, we can't really get him off the hook of having a double standard there.
Did you ever have some estimates of the number of birds he must have killed in his life? Because there were periods in his life when he would go shooting just about every day.
I should have done that. I didn't count the number he'd have shot in his life, but what I did do was count 2 things: the number of birds that he would shoot in each season, because he kept running totals of those, and it was several thousand until he becomes king, and then it reduces a bit because he has less time. But also I counted the number of days that he spent shooting each year when he was Prince of Wales, and remembering that the shooting season only begins in mid-August and stops in February. During those 6 months, whatever it is, he shot 100 days. So that is practically as though it was a job. He would go, almost every day except Sunday was the shooting day. But I suppose psychologically, what was important for him was that he was very good at it. I think that being seen to be good at something is important if you're a royal person.
Right. You mentioned earlier that he was close to his father, Edward VII, but I think it's also fair to say that he was rather frightened of his father. And I wonder if you think that that dynamic had rather disastrous results when it came to relationships with his own children.
Yeah. There's this famous quotation, which some people say he didn't say, but I'm sure he did say it, of George, who said to Lord Derby that my father was frightened of his mother, I was frightened of my father, and I'll damn well make sure my children are terrified of me. And he certainly did that. There are so many complicated things, I think, in these George's relationships with his sons, but there's no doubt at all that the son that he treats worst is his eldest son, later Edward VIII. And that even when Edward was a little boy, George found him difficult to deal with. And when Edward becomes, a sort of rock star character because of his amazingly successful tours of the empire, George becomes, I think, jealous of his popularity, and the rift between them deepens. And I think that George, within this relationship between father and son, George was the stronger character. George was the man with the power. And I think that you can't really get George off the hook for having contributed to an extent to the abdication by his quarrel with his eldest son.
Right. He, of course, predicted the abdication, did he not? Do you think he was predicting something that he himself has helped to bring about? Do you think David, Edward, was, congenitally ill-suited to the role anyway?
I think it's still not clear, actually, what the answer to that very good question is. I think, yes, George does contribute to the abdication by making Edward feel that the job of monarch is so sort of dull and sort of goody-goody, that it's something he really doesn't want. I think George plays a part, but I also think that Edward VIII was a very difficult character. And I don't think he wanted to be king. And I really think his preference was much, he wanted to marry Mrs. Simpson in a way that he really didn't want to become king. He made a choice. But the paradox is all over this situation, because in fact the abdication, although everybody got very worried about it, it didn't actually make a huge amount of difference. It was quite quickly patched up, and then the next king, George VI, is able quite easily to restore the position of the monarchy, and it doesn't. There's no moment really when it looks as though the monarchy is going to sort of break down. And you could argue that the reason that for the strength of the monarchy is basically George V and Queen Mary, and the way in which they brought the monarchy to such a sort of peak of popularity during the 1920s. So yes, George contributes to the abdication, but on the other hand, the survival of the abdication is to a large extent also because of George.
Right. George VI was quite dull too, and you could possibly say that our own Queen is quite dull. Do you think, have you drawn any conclusions about what makes an effective monarch from writing this book?
I think it's quite useful to distinguish between dull and ordinary. And I don't think that George V was really dull, but I do think that he was quite ordinary and that he understood ordinary people and ordinariness. And I think that this is what was needed if the monarchy was to survive into the new age of democracy. It couldn't be exotic. It couldn't be, full of wonderful sort of mistresses and sexual scandal and glamour in the way that Edward VII's court had been. It had to become ordinary, and it had to become a family monarchy, which people could identify with. Of course, the trouble with a family monarchy, as we all know, is that you are at once a hostage to fortune, and there are all sorts of potential problems that might happen with family monarchies. But I think George understood this. So I would say he was an ordinary is the word I'd use rather than dull.
Right. I like the word you use about his attitude. His philistinism may not be entirely sympathetic to us. I like the word you use for his attitude to art, which is, you say he had a robust attitude. And on touring a gallery, was it the Tate? Yes, of course, it was the Tate. And coming across a Cézanne, he has a look at it and he calls to his wife. He says, "Come here, Mary, here's something that will make you laugh."
Yes, that is, yes. He modern art was not his thing, or in fact, really art in general. I mean, but, remember the stamp collection. If he'd set his mind to it, if he'd been educated, possibly he might have amassed or contributed to the royal collection. But as it was, Queen Mary did all that. And she was really, is usually seen as the founder of the royal collection. And she, apparently on practically every piece of furniture in Windsor, there's a little label that can be found somewhere with Queen Mary writing dates and, the provenance of this piece of furniture. So I suppose that side of the job is done by his consort. So it doesn't matter so much that it's not an area which interests him greatly.
We have a few questions, so I'll ask them. But the last question for the moment I wanted to ask you, Jane, was Max Hastings' admiring review of this book in the Sunday Times. He says something that I think you'll disagree with. He says that you can feel the author, struggling against your dislike of George. I'm not sure that's what I felt when I was reading it.
No, I didn't feel that at all. I felt, I felt at the beginning, perhaps, when all he did was shoot a little bit. But as he became king, I became more and more admiring of him. So I don't know where that came from.
Okay, let me. From Mark Kellner. Have you thought of digitizing your archive?
I saw that comment and I absolutely think I should. I'm not very good at doing it, but I think we all ought to do that. And then we wouldn't have the problems with the papers being recycled. Yes, definitely.
Sarah Anderson asks, why do you think it was that made him change so dramatically when he became king? Was it a sense of duty?
Yes, it was a sense of duty. It was, I think it was a realization that he was able and capable and interested in the job. I think it was also what I was talking about Asquith forcing him to agree to do something which he later realized was something very wrong. That made him feel that he had to sort of understand what was right. So it's sort of being thrown in at the deep end that changes him, and he sort of swims. He might have sunk, but he swam, if you know what I mean. I think becoming king does, or queen, it has an unpredictable effect on people.
I don't know how I'd react, for instance. What was Nicolette Jones asked, what was his relationship with his mother like?
Oh, that's a good question. Queen Alexandra was incredibly beautiful, and also very affectionate and adoring, and loved small children. So she was a sort of ideal mother in some ways for George. And if you read his letters to Alexandra and compare them with his letters to his father, with Alexandra, he can tell her anything. He just pours it all, he confides in her about his girlfriends, all that sort of stuff, which I think very few young men could do at that time with their mothers. Whereas with his father, his letters are awfully stiff and formulaic, a bit like writing to the bank manager, that sort of letters. But they talk about the number of peasants they've shot and what the weather's been like and how ill all their relations are. So I think he adored Alexandra, but she was a very neglectful mother. And she'd be marvelous, and then there would be no letter, no nothing, and he wouldn't hear anything from her for months. And remember that his education was basically 3 years spent on various ships sailing around the world with his brother and a tutor, incredibly lonely. And so that at that rather important age, between about sort of 12 and 15 or 16, he has very little contact with either of his parents. So he loved his mother, but he also said about her that she was the most selfish person he'd ever met.
Of course, George, like his son George VI, wasn't born to be king. Jane Dismore asks, can you say something about his relationship with his elder brother, the ill-fated Duke of Clarence?
Yes, poor Eddie, the Duke of Clarence, was, well, he'd been born very prematurely, 2 months prematurely, and he was a very slow developer. I'm not sure whether he was, I don't think he was, if you look at his letters, they're very fluent. I think he was perfectly intelligent, but he was very sort of weak character, sweet character, but weak. And George was quite the opposite. George was a sort of rather sort of neat, tidy, determined little boy who quite liked fighting and that sort of thing. But George basically sort of protects Eddie. And when they're spending these 3 years sailing around the world, it's George who sort of goes to the sailing lessons and fights with the other boys, and Eddie doesn't do any homework at all, refuses to learn all the things that he ought to learn, but George protects him. So it's a very close relationship. And when Eddie suddenly dies, age 28, he died of pneumonia, and he was victim of the Spanish flu, which was one of the first pandemics. And also his constitution seems to have been weakened by various sexually transmitted diseases. And he dies very suddenly. But George is completely stunned. I mean, there's absolutely no sense you get that George was a second son who was desperate to have the, to have the crown. Not at all. He had wanted a quiet life of being a naval officer and going shooting, and now life is going to be quite different. And so Eddie sort of hangs over George's life really for the rest of his life. He writes with Eddie's pen. He always writes down when the anniversary of Eddie's death, and he marries Eddie's wife. Well, fiance, they weren't married, Eddie and Princess May of Teck. After a year's mourning, she's quickly, Queen Victoria matchmakes and pushes George and May together and almost forces them to marry. It is an arranged marriage, but an incredibly successful arranged marriage.
Caroline Osborne asks, what did George and Churchill think of each other?
Well, that's a good question. George and Churchill didn't, at first, they didn't think very much of each other at all. And George disliked Churchill because he thought, well, all the royal family in the 1900s disliked Churchill because he deserted the Tory party because he was thought to be a cad, because he showed off, all these sort of reasons. And so George agreed with that and thought that Churchill was unspeakable. And when Churchill lost his seat at an election in an important by-election in 1908 in Manchester, George was very pleased indeed that Churchill was out of politics. But interestingly, Churchill and George become much closer. In fact, in the 1920s, Churchill is one of the few politicians in the Conservative Party that George can really talk to. And I think that Churchill, well, we know, don't we, that Churchill was at heart a very strong monarchist. And so from Churchill's point of view, you can understand why this should have been so. And also, I think George recognises Churchill's intelligence. They quarrelled also about the Navy. They quarrelled about all sorts of things, but they didn't give up on each other.
Well, last question from Jane Winter. Having studied so many sovereigns, do you think the present monarchy will survive?
I would say that the monarchy was in a worse place in 1919 than it is in let's say 1921, than it is in 2021. I mean, I know there are problems, but it's not the same really as kings being toppled all over Europe and the danger of a revolution. So I would say that on the whole, I think it will survive.
Actually, we've got time for David Luff has just posted a question. Have you had your fill of the Windsors? Or are you so fond of working in the Round Tower that you're going to continue down the line?
Pass on that question. I don't.
Jane, that was wonderfully entertaining. Thank you. And I'm sure it's given everyone who's been watching and listening an idea of how entertaining your book is. There really isn't a dull moment in it. And it's a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nick. I've enjoyed it a lot. Thank you.
Good. Just before we go, last bit of housekeeping. Biographers Club Christmas party is on the 8th of December. And at that party, we'll present the Tony Lothian Prize for the best proposal for an uncommissioned biography. And you can see the shortlist for that prize up on the Biographers Club website. So thank you all for coming, and thanks so much, Jane.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.